All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for tuning in into session 3.3, Building a Drought Resilient Future of the 2021 Climate Adaptation Research Symposium. My name is Sylvia Gonzalez and I will be moderating this session. I am a senior researcher at the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation, where I direct community-based and environmental equity research projects with a focus on water and climate investments in low-income communities of color. I am joining you today from the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, California, home to the Fernandino and Tongva peoples. So that being said, I'd like to invite our audience to add their own land acknowledgements in the Q&A window. This will also let you know where the Q&A window is. Before we get started, I do want to acknowledge our collaborators who made today possible, in particular our sponsor, Edison International. I also want to thank Peter Wackamore and Michelle Einstein. They're our production coordinators. They're really working hard behind the scenes to make this session run smoothly. So thank you, Peter and Michelle. We also have a few housekeeping items that we want to remind you. We want to remind you that you can drag the presenter windows around your screen to best fit your setup at home or in your office. Also, if you have any questions for the presenters, feel free to ask them using the Q&A window. That's the window with the question mark, and it's on the right-hand side of the platform. We will get to your questions at the end of each presentation. So for this session, we're joined by three leading scholars, Ruth, who is studying drought resilient strategies and governance in California, Gina, who will be sharing some research on urban drought governance in South Africa and how it has met the needs across different income groups, and Steve, who will share about the links and drivers between climate change, water, migration, and conflicts in North African countries. We still have a lot to learn about climate change and what that means for our groundwater supply and governance, and what it means for frontline communities that are experiencing drought events. So today we hope that you leave the session with a greater understanding about these linkages as well as some solutions and strategies to address these problems. Our session will be structured with a 20-minute presentation from each panelist, followed with a Q&A discussion with the audience. So please feel free to chime in with your questions in the question box. Now, it's a pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Gina Ziervogel. Sorry, Gina. We are now going to, Gina is from the Department of Environmental and Geographical Science at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Gina is currently a visiting scholar at UC Santa Cruz. She has more than 2 decades of experience in the field of adaptation and vulnerability to climate change. Her research focuses on adaptation and resilience across different scales, from the household to the municipal level. Gina, I'd like to invite you to take the floor.
Hello, everybody. Great to be here. And thank you for the introduction, Sylvia. So I am going to go before Ruth because I think she's having problems getting on. So I just need to scroll down past her slides to get to mine. There we go. So I am going to be talking about some experience from South Africa that I hope you will find interesting. I am actually sitting at University California, Santa Cruz, because I'm here in California for 6 months. I've got a Fulbright scholarship and so I'm busy visiting. So it was really exciting for me to be part of this conference. And I really think there's a lot that we need to think about in terms of sharing lessons across different geographical areas. So today I'm going to be talking about the Cape Town drought and some of the lessons for strengthening urban drought governance. Oh, next slide. Sorry, it's jumped the slide forward button. It's not. Sorry, I'm battling to find the slide forward button, so I'll just have to do this manually. So I will talk. Sorry, every time I do it, it jumps to the top of the presentation, so it's a bit distracting. I will give you some context on the Cape Town situation, and I'm actually going to show you a short video as part of that because I think it gets the message across. and some context. And then I will go through 12 lessons learned from the drought that I think will be of relevance to people here, and end by looking at building an adaptive city. So as the work on the Cape Town drought, I've been working on climate adaptation for many years. And when the drought started unfolding in Cape Town, I thought, well, I have to work on this. And so I started interviewing people, trying to understand what was happening. And then I was asked by national government to actually do a piece looking at the Cape Town drought and the lessons learned for other municipalities in South Africa. So the document on the right, Unpacking the Cape Town Drought Lessons Learned, built on interviews with 20 of the most senior stakeholders in the city government and the provincial government who were involved in managing the water crisis. As part of that, I felt very strongly that these lessons and understanding what was happening within a city managing a significant crisis needed to be shared with the broader population. So I got some funding to work with a journalist, a science journalist, and we produced this book, Day Zero, One City's Response to a Record-Breaking Drought. And in dark blue there, the URL dayzero.org.za is the book, an online version of the book. So please take a look. It's got some good stories in there. Coming out of this as well, some colleagues worked on pulling together interviews, and there are 30 interviews of some of the people involved in the drought. And this is an incredible resource for those of you who've got students who want to work on the drought. There are 30 interviews there that have an amazing, rich selection of material to draw from that can really help understanding what happened. And so a bit of context that's important is, I'm sure, I hope you all know that Cape Town is in South Africa, right at the southern tip of Africa. And the city of Cape Town is a city of about 4 million citizens, so a relatively big city by some standards. We have a high level of inequality. A lot of people are living in informal settlements and walking to standpipes to get their water. We also have industry that relies on water, and tourism is a major sector with lots of people coming to visit our beautiful city that stopped coming during the drought. Similar to California, we've got agriculture that really demands a lot of water in surrounding areas. Our water source is mainly winter rainfall, and we have a Mediterranean climate. And our water source, 96% of Cape Town's water was coming from 6 dams that were outside the city's boundaries. And so managing this water was a really important part of the challenge, because there's something called the Western Cape Water Supply System, and that was managed with the National Department, Water Department. So I'm now going to turn over to this short video that will hopefully give you some insight into some of the challenges with the drought. So I hope that helped give you a sense of some of the issues that we are facing. What I want to show you here is a graph that gives you a bit of a sense of some of the issues quite clearly. On the top line, we see dam storage levels. And as I said, 96% of our water is from these 6 dams. And in 2014, on the left, you can see dam levels were up at almost 100%. 2015, they go down to 71%. 2016 down to 61%. And what you see in January 27 are very low dam levels that only go up to 38% in 2017. So this was really the heart of the drought and was a huge concern, because in January, February, March 2017, there was concern about the winter rainfall, and the bottom line shows the winter rainfall, shows the rainfall, and you can see the rainfall was low in 2017. There was enough to put the dams up to 38%, but there was huge concerns that we would not get through the summer months. And so what we see in the middle is very interesting, because we see agricultural use in red, and during summers there's a lot of use, and in winter there's not a lot of need of water from the dams because farmers have their own supplies. But what's very interesting to observe is the blue line of urban water use that you can see in January 2015 was up around 1,200 megaliters per day that urban water was using. And what we see during the drought was a halving of that. So in early 2018 and across 2018, water use dropped to just over 500 megaliters a day. And so that is one of the things that the city of Cape Town is most proud of, that they were able to halve water use. And it was for a number of reasons that they were able to do that. So I want to go to this slide that just gives you a bit of context of the governance. So in May, which is just before the winter rains, there was really a lot of concern, and the mayor elevated the issue of the drought to the most senior level of city management. So she took it away from the water department, and she created a central group of people to manage that. So that was really quite interesting, and they ran a number of scenarios. One of them was the new normal: what if it doesn't rain again, or what if rainfall is very limited, what are we going to do? And that's really when the crisis planning started around augmenting water supplies, finding new sources. There were some temporary desalination plants that were put in place, trying to just get as much water as possible. There was also groundwater that came online, and some water reuse, but really hard to scale up these things on a short timeline. In August 2017, a water resilience advisory committee was formed. And this is quite interesting from a governance perspective, because the city put this in place, and it's part of what municipal governments can do, but they drew on external experts to engage with the city and advise the city on their response. So I was on that water resilience advisory committee, and I still am. So here in Santa Cruz, I'm actually looking at the water supply advisory committee that they had during the drought a few years ago, where they actually ran for a finite amount of time of 2 years, put in place a number of suggestions that the city of Santa Cruz is now following up. However, we are continuing this committee to engage on water-related issues with city and external advisors. There was a disaster coordinating committee put in place that was seen as very important for trying to make sure that we could manage a large-scale disaster. And then a new water strategy was started in 2018, and that has been ongoing. So there was a lot of focus on the numbers, communication, really getting people to change behavior. We were told we had to live an 87-liter life that dropped to 50 liters per day. We were told when day 0 was, which was the day when the taps were going to run dry, in the sense that they would turn off taps for residents, and they would still maintain basic services, but as residents, we would then have to queue for water. This did not happen, and the rain did come, and enough water was secured that this didn't have to happen, but a lot of lessons were learned. So pulling from this, I pulled together 12 lessons that fall under 4 different groups, and I'm going to talk briefly about these 12 with a focus on the strengthening governance area. So lesson 1 was about building systems and relationships of mutual accountability for effective water management between spheres of government. We talk about spheres of government as our national, federal, and then our provincial instead of state, and then our local government. So our National Department of Water and Sanitation had to approve restrictions. They were slow to respond, so then the city started approving those themselves and putting them in place. Groundwater is managed by the national level. That was a very tricky situation. Lots of people were thinking boreholes. You could do that at a household level. You needed to get permission if you were a bigger business, and that was taking a while to come through. Alien vegetation, we have a lot of pine trees, eucalyptus that were taking water. Permission for clearing that was tricky. The Western Cape water supply system of the dam management, it was clear that the data was not sufficiently up to date. And there was limited enforcement of restrictions, particularly in the agricultural sector in the year of 2016. And there's a sense that if those had been enforced, we wouldn't have been in such a bad position. Lesson 2 was really about working within the city government and strengthening what you might call horizontal or transversal management between and within municipal departments and entities. The scale of this drought was so extreme that it really was a whole of city event. And so early on, disaster management identified the drought, but they don't have a lot of clout in the city. As I mentioned, the mayor prioritized the drought response, and so this became the responsibility of the directorate of the mayor. That was very important from our perspective, where we then had a lot of seniority in seeing how this was responded and how leadership was taken forward. And later in 2018, it was moved back to water and sanitation. But what was very exciting to see is that the water strategy that came out of it was not held by the water and sanitation department like most water strategies and policies have in the past. The water strategy that is in place now is really a whole of city document, and it's a very holistic document. It's built on the resilience strategy that the city was doing at the same time, and a real shift in understanding of how water is seen. The third lesson around governance was to invest in partnerships between the city government. And this is one I'd really emphasize here in California. How can you put in place those partnerships before a major crisis occurs? And so the reality is that in the city of Cape Town, there were poor partnerships in many ways with business and civil society before the drought. There were some key individuals that were really important that came in to support the work. There were some intermediaries. The Worldwide Fund for Nature was a really important player, bringing in some of the science. They were linked to the university. I talked about the Section 80 committee, which was the Water Resilience Advisory Committee that brought in some of these intermediaries. But it was so clear during the drought that this was critical because businesses wanted to know what decisions to make, and they didn't know who to go to at first. And so those relationships were built during the drought. In our city, involving civil society is very important, but the city of Cape Town is known for doing it poorly. And so low-income people were particularly concerned, and actually the city was doing a lot to ensure that the taps in low-income areas would not be turned off, but because of lack of communication on the governance, people were unclear about that. So there was a lot of communication on the details of the water and how much water there was, but less on the governance and what the city was doing. So one of the things I just wanted to share coming out of the water strategy that has emerged in the last few years is where the city talks about having a whole of society approach, that they want to adopt a collaborative approach in implementing the strategy. We've heard from earlier sessions this morning how important collaboration is, how important it is to understand citizens' perspectives, and the water strategy talks about creating an enabling environment to be responsive to citizen-led water initiatives. They also talk about effective partnering, joint problem identification, co-design, and co-implementation. And that's great, and I've had input to the strategy, and I really support this. But the reality is what's happening in practice, and they are building the implementation strategy at present. But one of the projects that I developed coming out of this that I can't talk about today in detail, but I just think highlights a very important issue about data that came up in the plenary at lunch, is that yes, we're focusing on data, and that's the next set of lessons I'll talk about, but what data is it? And how do we feed in this bottom-up lived reality of what it means to experience this? We talked about mental health. What are the people who are living through these crises actually experiencing? So we developed a project to collect some of these stories around water stress in low-income areas. And importantly for us, it's also about sharing this information back to the community and then looking at how this can feed into city decision making. And the reality is, in the work we're seeing at the moment, this more qualitative and bottom-up, quantitative as well, data is quite hard to insert in city decision making. So the second area around data expertise and communication is making sure that we understand the local water system, ensuring that we share information about the water situation. And what really started to increase the public's understanding of water was when the City of Cape Town put out this dashboard. They talked about day zero. What was the current water usage? What were they aiming for? What were the dam levels at? It was really easy to see this. And then they created this, what they called the green dot map, which you can see on the slide, where they actually noted which households were using a low amount of water and were recognizing them for their good efforts, which had issues around data sharing, but really was a behavior change tool. The third area is about taking a systems approach and actively managing and integrating diverse parts of the water system. And I would say that there was a big shift in this during the drought, where initially it was seen very much as an infrastructure problem, water supply in the city, because it could be managed like that in the past. But during the drought, it was clear that the economic aspects, the social aspects, the environmental aspects had not received enough attention, and they started to be seen as part of the system, which was really important. A robust network system of water supply, as I mentioned, we had mainly dam water. We started using more groundwater, exploring options for desalination, looking at reuse more and efficiency, really important. And then recognizing the current financial model for water and its limitations. It's really hard for a city government who needs to pay for their water when they then want customers during a drought to use much less water than usual because they don't have water, but then how do you pay for the water? And in South Africa, we cross-subsidize water with people who can afford to pay for water, paying for those who can't pay for water. So I really think this is one of the big challenges around sustainability and water use going forward. So the last area around building adaptive capacity is about developing a water-sensitive city vision. How do we start to look at that holistic vision? And the City of Cape Town has started to do this. Very exciting work coming out of Singapore and Australasia on water-sensitive cities. They've spent a lot more effort trying to integrate climate change into water planning. It was there before, but not sufficiently, and they really saw that during the drought and realized that they hadn't thought through the scenarios enough, hadn't worked with the climate scientists closely enough. And then last lesson is strengthening leadership and the capacity to enable flexible, adaptive decision-making. We're going to need this more going forward, and we had some challenges over politicians and politics, and also building the capacity of leaders to work in these kinds of complex situations. So this figure kind of pulls all those points together in a schematic around thinking about an adaptive water-sensitive city, that we need to work across scales, we need to engage different players, and we need to think carefully about data and how we bring that into the situation. And the City of Cape Town kind of pulled this graphic together to think about the 12 lessons because they were really excited about them, and I think this can be used going forward. So I'm not going to stop on that slide because I know I need to wrap up. So the question is, have we built a more adaptive city? I think we've been doing a lot to build it. We are in a much better place post the drought. Do we want a drought and a crisis to be in this better place? Ideally not. But what can we put in place now to ensure that we can be more adaptive? And the one quote that I just wanted to end with from one of the interviewees was, we need to move from building resilient infrastructure to building a resilient system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gina, for sharing lessons learned from Cape Town's approach to collaborative and systems change to water governance. Now I'd like to introduce our second panelist, Dr. Stephen Commins. He is a lecturer at the UCLA Department of Urban Planning. The Department of Urban Planning has a special place in my heart because that's where I completed my graduate studies. Steve is also the Associate Director of the Global Public Affairs Initiative at the Luskin School. He works in the areas of regional and international development with an emphasis on service delivery in fragile states. His most recent work focuses on the livelihoods of displaced populations in the Middle East and countries in North Africa. Steve, I'd like to invite you to.
Sylvia, I see a note in the chat that Ruth is available and would like to go next. So could you check on that? I don't want to usurp that.
Ruth, would you like to go next? I think I'm not seeing the note. There we go. So I will introduce Ruth. Dr. Ruth Langridge is a senior researcher in the politics department and legal studies at the University of California at Santa Cruz. Her expertise is on California's water law and policy. Her research focuses on the processes and relations that enable access to water and create resilience to water scarcity, groundwater management, and water supply security under climate change. Ruth, I'd like to invite you to take the floor now. Ruth, could you turn your camera and microphone on, please? So it looks like we're still having some technical difficulties. Steve, I think it's back to you.
All right, then we're going to have to switch the slides because I can't talk about that topic. Okay. So this project that I'll report on was funded by the UK Department for International Development before it was absorbed into the new Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office and the British government. The focus was to try to understand the climate, water, and migration nexus in the Maghreb. So after the previous presentation by Gina, which flipping all the way to the other end of the African continent, it's important to note that the driver of this research and of similar research in the Maghreb is very much driven in part by the security interests of France, Spain, Italy, as well as the UK. And even though the UK has now left the EU, it's very much part of trying to understand what type of migration will happen within North Africa, including from the Sahel into Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and what kind of migration will happen across the Mediterranean, which has been a crisis issue going back a long time, but especially since the Libyan civil war. So the research was done through an institution called the Center for Mediterranean Integration. I'd worked with them for 5 years, mostly looking at municipalities in the Middle East hosting Syrian refugees. We began to develop a particular interest in water and water services in countries like Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. And this then translated to a partnership with the International Water Management Institute and a social enterprise called CWAS that seeks particularly to develop new green solutions to water management in the Middle East. The focus was on Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria. We were supposed to do some work with Libya. Obviously, that's not the case. I think what's critical also to note is that what we were doing was trying to get away from the very linear debates and discussions and a lot of articles that come out, not only in the popular media, but sometimes within climate science, that climate change and lack of water equals conflict. We were trying to say it's more complicated than that. So what we wanted to avoid was, first of all, a simplistic and deterministic approach where you started with climate, then you had conflict, and this led to migration. The work that we drew upon, particularly in Tunisia, Morocco, less so in Algeria, but there was older research in Algeria, showed that migration was not primarily driven by conflict, was not primarily driven by climate, but driven particularly by the politics of water and land in rural areas. So in those areas where small farmers, women, young people seeking to move into agriculture or the rural economy, where they were able to get land or to be productive, they did not necessarily migrate. So this very simplistic climate equals conflict equals migration does not provide sound policy guidance for governments, for UN agencies, for regional development banks, or for the European Union. So we thought, how can we think about it in a different way? So we wanted to look at what were the drivers, both climate but also non-climate. We recognized, and the evidence is quite clear, that North Africa is getting hotter and drier. Indeed, if one goes from Mauritania and Morocco all the way across to Jordan and Iraq and Syria, the outlook in terms of increased temperatures, the outlook in terms of rainfall, the outlook in terms of water availability is very daunting. At the same time, though, we also wanted to emphasize the non-climate drivers, and thus particularly the intermediating factors. And we would highlight government policies, because when you drill down into different communities in these three countries, government land tenure policies, government financial policies, who can get loans for land, who gets loans to do irrigation, all of these were important, and just as important in terms of the decision making made by people in rural communities as climate itself. We then wanted to look at the possible impacts. We then wanted to say, okay, what's the significance of migration outcomes? Why are people migrating? Doing interviews at the household level, doing interviews in the cities of migrants, and then trying to look at data done by UNHCR and the International Office of Migration on migrants who moved to Western Europe. And then say, okay, what are the feedback loops? That's a significant issue, because sometimes we could say climate will make things worse, but sometimes we could argue that the way the government of Morocco provides title to land could be equally important. So in Tunisia, what we found was that the threats of desertification and drought have significant implication for food and water security, and it threatens around half of the land area which has been suitable for agriculture. One of the key things we discovered in doing the interviews and then working with IWMI, with some local researcher, the agricultural base was being stressed not just because of the water access, but also because they were depleting the land quality that had allowed cereal land to be held fallow in between seasons of planting. And so in interviewing people, and particularly I'll show in a minute a map of what was done looking at Morocco and Tunisia, we really found that many local community groups were quite aware about the importance of planting trees, of protecting from erosion and the like, and thus there was often a gap between what the governments promised to do and what was actually happening at the lives of the farmers. In Algeria, we found again a lot of pressure around land availability, erosion, vegetation loss. One of the things that we found in Algeria, and this is something that goes back a decade to the Arab Spring, much of the literature on the Arab Spring focuses on protests in Tunis, which was the origins, protests in Rabat, protests in Algiers, big protests, as we know, in Cairo, tragically, many protests in Syria, which led to civil war, which really devastated the country. In Algeria, there's been an ongoing protest movement called the Hirak. And this movement has gone up and down. It's very popular based. It's run into the challenges of a very sclerotic political system. The Hirak is often portrayed again as this urban movement, but conversations with Algerian researchers confidentially, because of the difficulties of making open political statements in the country, they argued very strongly that Hirak also reflects the anger and the sense of alienation of many farming communities who believe that the petro elite of Algeria has been buying up land or buying up water rights. And so in Algeria, there is a strong political movement, quite different than in Tunisia, which has some democratic structures. So it's a big contestation. And one thing we found in the work that we did was it's likely to increase the level of tension in Algeria over these issues of land rights and land access. Now, in Morocco, we did a study of some basin areas, which you can see on the right, and you can see that this one area, which has traditionally been a farm basin, it is going to have very high levels of desertification before 2030. And this is really critical because Morocco has this big investment, what they call the Green Plan, which I'll talk about in a minute. And while the government has a very good program of monitoring drought, monitoring the impacts of drought, we found not only were there decreased land areas suitable for agriculture, but also that the Green Plan tended not to address the same problems we found in Tunisia and Algeria, and that problem is small farmers, marginal people being pushed out. The King of Morocco is the ruler. They have a parliament and lots of the show of democracy. But at the end of the day, the king runs things. And we did quite a bit of research with Moroccan scholars and Moroccan civil society organizations. It is quite clear one of the risks of the Green Plan is it's simply going to give more land with irrigation to people with money and connections to the king, which is not going to solve the problem. And indeed, in particular, there's concern that it'll increase outmigration, not necessarily because of the climate impact on water, but the political impact on water. So we then developed a model, which anybody who wants a copy of the slideshow, or indeed the draft paper we did, I can show, looking at the fact that migration decisions came from many different factors. And I don't ask you to lose your eyesight on this, but to note that we really argued from what we'd seen from the interviews that migration decisions were not linear, but part of a number of loops and sets of information. So this means that climate trends are tied into socio-demographic factors, they're tied into economic factors, agricultural development policy, specific climate change relevant policies, livelihood policies, what kind of rural livelihoods are available, rather than the linear approach that often appears and is highlighted in sometimes the media, sometimes in very great headlines, but don't in fact convey the reality on the ground. So the Maghreb policy goals we came up with to say, how do you prepare North African countries is first of all to have targeted, people-centered, community-led, customized solutions. Because if you took 50 different communities in Morocco or Algeria, the nature of the climate water mix will be different. Secondly, and very importantly, people will experience climate shocks. You look at the United States, a third of the United States between fires, hurricanes, floods have had climate shocks. We also see in the United States that the ability of vulnerable and poor households to respond is much less than those who have resources. So in particular, helping poor and vulnerable households to recover is critical, and then much better climate information systems, which are really lacking in most of these countries, and particularly lacking in terms of the connection between whatever technical resources are available and what can be done at the community level. So this means you have to have an institutional and policy response. You need to have things like financing available. You need to have climate insurance, but this has to be tied into local communities and how local communities can make decisions about securing their future. So we said you have to have a simple framework to make an understanding that differentiates the seasonal from the international, the internal to external. Migration decision-making has to be understood as part of a range of sociological economic factors, and it can't just be one simple policy threat. We then developed a very complex matrix, and again, anyone who wishes to see this is glad to contact me or ask for it. But basically, we said there have to be policies that are clear. There have to be policies based on the realities of what we found, not policies based upon climate equals lack of water equals conflict equals migration. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Ruth, are we ready to go next?
Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Good. Are you going to get to my slides then? Okay, just made sure there would be no phone calls. Okay, so groundwater and drought are on everybody's mind right now. The water shortages and drought were seen to be the biggest environmental concern by the Public Policy Institute of California. And today I'm going to talk about groundwater and drought resilience. So it's on everyone's mind in California. So we're zooming into the state where the conference is actually occurring. And here is what people have said about drought. The water level at Lake Shasta dropped precipitously. Forecast worst drought ever. California's drought is the most severe in at least 1,200 years. Drought worsens in Southern California from extreme to exceptional drought conditions. The issue with this, however, is that it's not this year's drought. The first one was from 1978. The second one was from 2009. The third one was from 2012-2016 drought. And the last one is today from 2021. And so the big question is, are we in the same old story, or have we actually reduced our vulnerability to drought in California? You would think that we would have done this by now, because if you look at the history of California's droughts, you can see that we have periodic droughts that are often followed by very wet periods. But for whatever reason, we have not been able to successfully tackle that issue. Well, why groundwater in drought? Well, in California, groundwater provides 40% of our overall water supply under average hydrologic conditions, and it's a critical source of backup during drought when increased pumping occurs to compensate for reduced surface supplies and decreased soil moisture. It really should be our strategic drought reserve. And the realization of the value of groundwater in drought protection was noted by authors as far as 80 years ago, during the droughts of 1928-34 and 1948. Carrie McWilliams, California the Great, exception bemoaned the lack of action over that drought. So during each recent drought, groundwater levels declined in many basins. And the red shows you the decrease during the 2012-2013, 2014 drought. But groundwater levels did not fully recover during wet periods. And this is groundwater depletion in California's Central Valley from 1965 to 2015. And you can see, even though there were alternating wet and dry years, groundwater levels continue to drop. What is our typical response in the past to droughts and water shortages? Well, clearly conservation, and that's important. It's mostly been voluntary. There have been some mandates, but those are often rescinded. So for example, in 2015, the Water Board set out emergency regulations requiring an immediate 25% reduction in overall potable urban water use for 411 districts. But in 2016, they eliminated those standards for 379 districts, allowing them to temporarily set their own self-reported conservation standards until 2017. And I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. The other thing that we do is we pump more groundwater. And you can see between 1985 and 1992, during that drought, that graph really shows how as water in surface water in reservoirs declined, groundwater wells were drilled. And you saw that again in the 2012 to 2014, 2015 drought, when well permits increased. We also use other supply side strategies because during a drought, what you generally hear is we need more water. So I'm going to talk first about imported water, and to understand our relationship with imported water in California, you really need to know a little bit about the climate and water. So there's more rain in the northern part of our state and less in the south, and there's a heavy spring runoff from snowmelt. So Californians worked around this because we developed much of the Central Valley and Southern California by essentially building two major projects, the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project. The Central Valley was a federal project, and it was built in response to Central Valley Ag that was pumping groundwater and very concerned about the fact that wells were going dry and there was land subsidence. And then that didn't seem to do the trick. And so we also built the State Water Project that then took, again, heavy spring runoff from snowmelt and captured it in reservoirs and sent it down over the Tehachapi's into Southern California, as well as other coastal areas. So you would think we'd be okay, but in fact, despite all that new imported water from the big projects over time, replenishment continued to be less than withdrawals in many areas. So you can see all those surface water deliveries, and they alternated somewhat between wet and dry periods, but clearly the groundwater storage change, and again, this is a Central Valley study, between 1962 and 2015, continued to decline. So imported water didn't exactly solve our drought situation. We've also turned to recycled water, and it's gradually been promoted as a drought-proof water source. Annual use has increased, and even though it's still a very small percent of urban used and even smaller for ag used, the Water Board nevertheless has set a very high target for the future of 2.5 million acre feet, and many agencies are exploring ways to achieve that. But it may not really be a drought-proof source. Pizzetti and her colleagues found that, in fact, mandatory urban water use reductions occurred during the 2012-2015 drought because, in fact, when you use less water, there's less wastewater, so there's less water to be recycled. One way to potentially get around that is to make sure that the place where you really conserve water is outdoor, and that will allow you to basically avoid that issue. A third area that's often pushed very hard, especially during drought, is that we need more desalination plants. And again, it could provide a long-term water source during drought. There are some serious issues with it. Although the cost has fallen, it remains an expensive proposition. Significant energy is required, more than any other option. It produces highly concentrated salt brine that is both a problem for both the ocean and for organisms that live in the ocean. And even more important, it's the building of desalination plants, whether they should be public, whether they should be private, et cetera, is frequently controversial. It's really interesting to note from the governor's water resilience portfolio, I targeted California's South Coast region where the conference is occurring. And you can see between 1998 and 2015, in fact, it's the big water projects and groundwater that really have continued to remain as the major sources of water. So despite pushing for recycled water, it hasn't really changed that much. And it's going to be a problem for the imported water under climate change, because we're going to see that it's less reliable and more expensive. And that's going to be particularly true under climate change, where we're going to see drier springs and more frequent and severe droughts in that region. We've also used and pushed for water banking and water transfers. And in fact, in the 21st century, large groundwater banks were established that currently serve as essentially investor-run storage facilities at one site, where they receive and deposit water in wet years that can subsequently be withdrawn and needed and transported for use at different sites. There are, again, some issues with the larger groundwater banks, where off-site parties, when water is withdrawn from these sites, off-site parties can be affected. And there are sometimes land use consequences. And importantly, there's no real requirement to basically set aside drought reserves. So where are we today? Well, we are still focused on conservation, and now we have added in the state in 2018 and 2019 that water agencies have to produce a water shortage contingency plan and drought risk assessment every 5 years, as well as an annual water efficiency standard, and that's definitely an improvement. Whoops, I'm gonna back up for a moment. And we've also continued with our supply side strategies of imported water, groundwater, and recycled water. And you can see that again in the water resilience portfolio, where those were emphasized along with increased surface water storage and stormwater capture, which I'm not going to talk about today, but is a potential promising direction. So then the question is, where are we today with groundwater? Has groundwater management improved? Because, again, according to the Army Corps of Engineers, water in groundwater aquifers continues to be the most strategic weapon against drought. Well, we did, in fact, in 2014, pass the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. But to sort of back that up, previous to that act, landowners overlying a groundwater basin could pump as much as they wanted. That was reasonable with respect to other overlying owners, so long as they were in compliance with some other public interest doctrines. And there was no permit system to withdraw groundwater. So in fact, as you saw, many basins became depleted. So when the act was passed, it was a breakthrough for basins now to have to manage sustainably and avoid unacceptable impacts that are mentioned there: chronic lowering of groundwater levels, reduction in storage, and associated impacts. It requires the formation of groundwater sustainability agencies for many basins, and they're required to submit groundwater sustainability plans that document their conditions. And if the state does not accept the plans and finds them insufficient, the state can step in. So it was a big improvement, or at least it's hoped to be a big improvement. There are some issues still with Sigma, and one is the issue of accumulated overdraft, a loss of storage over time. So when you think about what's happened with many of the groundwater basins in the state, what's happened is, prior to Sigma, a lot of them lost significant amounts of storage. There was a really big hole in those groundwater basins. Sigma only requires you to start when the act was passed and move forward and not create a bigger hole. And what that really means is that, in fact, you have less groundwater in your basin should a drought occur. Sometimes folks saw that as a good thing and intentionally withdrew water, hoping to be able to fill it again with imported water. But as we've seen, imported water is going to be more expensive, less reliable in the future. And so it's not clear that is going to be a solution. So what kinds of requirements and incentives are we actually having to move ahead to something more positive? And I'm going to discuss 3 areas. Whoops, sorry. Land use policies, capturing floodwaters to reduce flooding and combat drought, and establishing local drought reserves. So the first, which is linking land use policies and water supplies, I think is going to be one of the next areas the state is going to probably focus on. So way back in 1995 and 2000, there were some laws that were passed that linked long-term water supply availability before new large projects could be built. And those were really large projects, for example, over 500 housing units. But then in 2018, as mentioned, there were some new laws passed that required water shortage contingency plans and drought risk assessments every 5 years for many more water agencies and did not necessarily focus just on large developments. And so what you started to see was general plans now incorporating this idea into their documents. So for example, in Monterey, if a permit is required for a new development, you can't get it unless you can show a long-term sustainable water supply. Similarly, in the small town of Greenfield in the Salinas Valley. A second area that's really moved ahead is FloodMar, which uses increased flood flows projected under climate change for the triple benefit of both recharging aquifers and for irrigation. So when you irrigate, the farmers don't have to pump their groundwater, and moreover, those floodwaters can help to recharge groundwater aquifers. So there's been a really jump in research on this, even though there was a little bit of informal work on this prior to Sigma, for example. And now work has shown that they can be more cost effective than using just groundwater pumping. The risk of groundwater contamination can be mitigated. Significant high magnet flows can be available. And there's researching what kinds of crops can stand up to flooding. An area that I have been particularly interested in is developing local drought reserves. And here's the thing, you can simply get more water, but you can even put it back into the ground, but it will only create drought resilience if that water is somehow set aside for a drought reserve, an emergency drought reserve. Now, we realize that groundwater isn't a stagnant thing and it's going to be moving, but you can sort of assess through your levels where you are and whether you're going to be able to address a drought situation. And we can see how important that is, because without doing that, we are not going to necessarily add more water and still be drought resilient. This was done a couple of years ago. Bruce Daniels, who's now with the Soquel Creek Water District, looked at how it could be done with me. It was research that we did together. And he put this very nice graph together to show how groundwater levels could be where you are, where you want to be to protect against unacceptable impacts. In this case, it was saltwater intrusion. And what you'd need to do to make sure that your groundwater levels would not drop during a drought. And in fact, there are a couple of basins that are now using a variety of approaches for this, which is interesting because when I first became interested in local drought reserves and you did a Google search, you would find almost nothing. In fact, Goleta was one of the few that jumped up, and they have done something really quite interesting. They are a small district on the central coast of California. They get surface water from a Bureau of Reclamation project that basically developed Lake Cachuma as a storage facility that could store floodwaters from the Santa Ynez River and from groundwater. They were adjudicated in the 1980s, and they also passed a safe ordinance, and this enabled them to get state water project. But the ordinance also spelled out how they could use the water. Sorry. Okay, first they had to recover the basin to 1972 levels. But then they also had to establish an additional drought buffer, and they would not do any new hookups until this occurred. They also determined when that drought buffer could be used, when there were reduced deliveries from Lake Kachuma. And once all of this was accomplished, they could then provide new service connections. However, each new service connection had to increase the annual storage commitment to the drought buffer so that when a drought occurred, they would still have that water available. It helped them significantly during the 2012-2016 drought, but just to back up there, they did indeed succeed in really increasing the groundwater levels in their basin. And then during that 2012 to 2016 drought, groundwater really saved them. It was an area that was very dry, and they were able to draw on that groundwater reserve. They didn't get as much rain after that. And so right now they're trying very hard to fill their basin and relying on Lake Kachuma water and State Water Project water, even though there's not a lot of it. Another another agency that has done something as well to develop a drought reserve, they are a small foothill adjudicated basins in the Tehachapi Mountains. And they get State Water Project, but now their water project comes with a recharge component. And in particular, municipal and industrial are required to bank a 5-year supply over 10 years as a local drought reserve that can be tapped into during drought. Monterey Peninsula as well is another area that has done some really interesting things. It's a complex area with multiple management districts, and we're going to particularly look at the Monterey Peninsula Water Management District on the Seaside Basin, which is an adjudicated groundwater basin, and Salinas Valley growers and how they got together. Essentially, the way that system works, in a very simple way to describe it, is that excess winter flows from the Carmel River, basically is injected into Seaside Basin, and then it's used for a coastal distribution system where it's pumped to local farmers along the coast so that they do not have to pump their groundwater. But importantly, they negotiated with the Salinas Valley growers where there was an overflow pond, and they would use that water. It would be purified and recharged into the Seaside Basin, and also used for the coastal distribution system. But 1,000 acre feet were now going to be provided to the Salinas Valley growers in a dry year from a local drought reserve. And finally, again, as mentioned, you're starting to see similar issues regarding the availability of water before new development. And I wanted to highlight the City of Marina General Plan, again, in the Monterey area. And so they are determined to maintain a 15% reserve so that no new development can occur unless they have that reserve there. And so how have we managed post-Sigma? Have we actually improved things after that rather depressing opening where I wondered if we were, in fact, reducing our vulnerability? Well, we do have some mandatory management to achieve sustainability. We do have some more strict conservation coming down the road. There's a continuing emphasis on conservation. We are somewhat concerned about demand hardening, where each drought you try and improve your conservation options. So you make sure you have all low flow toilets, et cetera. And after a while, those low hanging fruits are more difficult. However, we're still focusing on that water conservation. And you are seeing more agencies now really regulating their pumping and trying not to have so much groundwater withdrawal. There is an emphasis on diversifying supply and on increasing recycled water. Some of that still remains an issue, as well as the problem with desal plants. We do see increased use of this triple benefit for flood mar, for both recharge, irrigation, and drought resilience. We do see the large groundwater banks. That hasn't changed very much over the years, but we do see definitely an increased emphasis on turning to local agencies to really think about developing these local groundwater drought reserves as essentially strategic water reserves during a drought. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Now, I would like to ask the audience if they have any questions. Now is a good time to add your questions to the question box. Again, that's the panel. It's on the right panel and it has a little question mark. While we do that, I'd like to invite our three panelists to go live and we can have a discussion together. Thank you again. And I have one question for Gina and Steve. You know, you both touched on the importance of collaborative and people-centered approaches to water drought management. And I'm wondering, within your context, did you observe any community-led or community-initiated solutions? Or were these solutions mostly like government-initiated or top-down?
Sure, I'm happy to start. I think for me, what was very interesting during the drought is that there were a lot of community solutions that started emerging. And we saw a similar thing during COVID, which I think is really interesting. When you have this large-scale city crisis, people come together. And so during COVID, we had what were called community action networks. And during the drought, neighborhoods came together to try and identify who was most vulnerable, who might be cut off with water, who might be able to share boreholes. And so for me, that's something that has to be tapped into going forward, because governments alone cannot manage the state of the challenge that we're in, and we have to draw on different groups. Similarly, the private sector really started playing a very important role, trying to provide public services as well, trying to use their water supplies where they could for benefit. And I think for me, what's important is trying to understand how governments can look at engaging and partnering more effectively, because it really was an important thing in both of those crises.
I wonder if I could add something there. I think that's in some ways the beauty of SIGMA, when you think about how do you have the state government actually step in when groundwater basins and communities are so different all around the state. And they really followed something that our Clean Water Act does, which is the federal government sets certain standards and it's up to the states to sort of implement those standards. And that's exactly what SIGMA did. It said, well, here are some standards. We haven't been doing very well, but in fact, we really have to do better. And we have to do better to meet these standards. But you can meet these standards any way that you want locally. And in fact, what it did do, it kind of incentivized the formation of all these local groundwater agencies. Many areas didn't even have that kind of coordination, and you saw a lot of different water agencies and districts coming together to form those groundwater sustainability agencies. So it was this real mix of the state government stepping in and saying, okay, we can't go on the way we are, we have to set standards, but guess what? You people can set those standards. Rather can set the way to meet those standards. And I think that was pretty interesting. Of course, time will tell how effective it was.
So I think, you know, from my experience, Tunisia is a very open political space. And so you had both really powerful women's organizations in rural areas. You also very powerful organization of young people. And they're working around water, land title, land access, contesting the awarding of water rights to certain privileged groups. So it's very strong in Tunisia. There are, to some extent, women's and youth organizations in Morocco. Again, it's that funny political space. If you don't say bad things about the king, you can kind of do certain things. And then across the entire North African region, there's very interesting networks of young people who've organized to work on sort of solutions, green solutions to climate problems in general. And I've had the chance to sit in on some of their events. Unfortunately, they started at midnight California time, so then I sort of passed out for the rest of the day. But they're very lively, they're very innovative. It's an interesting support network because they've drawn in young people from Portugal, Spain, France, Italy, and Greece to sort of look at the Mediterranean and the Green Mediterranean. Very much bottom up, very much driven by young people under 25. So it's very exciting. And again, the same with women. There's some interesting Mediterranean women's networks. Now, you always have to be careful, because my experience is that you have certain people who show up at every UN conference, but they represent nobody other than themselves, and they're very articulate. So you cut below that and look at people working in Bedouin communities, working in Arabic, working in Berber communities, and that's where you find the really interesting work. And it's lively, and it's only growing precisely because the issue of resource stress, access to water and land is becoming more intense.
Ruth, is there a public participation process in the management strategies that you described in your presentation?
In Sigma?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, there is. It's a little mixed because, again, it's not a mandatory sort of statement, but yes, there is a process for public participation, and again, you're going to get some varying opinions on whether it's actually working. But from my perspective, sort of looking prior to Sigma and then post Sigma, it feels as if they have really brought together many more interests than was happening before. I mean, it was very much an area, a state that was dominated by, I would say, fairly large interests, both whether it's urban or agricultural. And you are seeing, for a variety of reasons, much more focus on more disadvantaged communities, on more rural communities. And I was actually really privy to the formation of the Monterey, the Salinas Valley Groundwater Sustainability Agency. And it was facilitated by someone that tried to bring all of the groups together. And again, there's been some critiques, where different people were not happy with enough representation for one group or another group. There were certain compromises, but compared to what was happening before, you were really seeing a lot more engagement. That was my thinking on that. Folks have stepped in and said not enough, and but it's definitely increased.
Thank you, Ruth. So we do have a question from the audience for Steve from Bradley, Cleveland. Given the concern over migration from Central America to the U.S., are there lessons from your work in Africa that might apply to the Americas?
Great question. Actually, a group of students in the disaster management class I teach every spring did a project for the Hilton Foundation looking at the drivers of migration in Central America. So I think one lesson is that Central America is profoundly hit by different aspects of climate change. And one of the things that's probably been missed, which we came up with in the class project, is that we think about the hurricanes and the storms. In fact, parts of Central America are badly hit by drought. So there's severe impoverishment in the rural areas. I think the biggest difference is that Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, leaving poor Libya aside, even Algeria with the Iraq, the level of violence is very small compared to the level of violence across Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, political oppression. So there's really some difficult issues in Central America, which are profoundly political, which aren't going to be answered easily, which don't have a quick solution. There's a number of programs I've worked with in terms of youth mediation, trying to get young people out of gangs, but it's very difficult. And I don't have a quick answer. Standing up as the vice president and saying, don't come to America is not really a solution to a problem, except to say that we're listening to American voters. So I don't have a quick answer. If you want to get in touch with me, I can share the work that we did in the spring quarter. I can share you the papers we did and the background materials. I think the biggest lesson from the work in the Maghreb is, again, climate by itself isn't the problem. There's an old book, almost 50 years old, called Nature Please Not Guilty, and it's still today. That is, yes, climate impact of Ida or the fires is daunting, but how your political, economic, social structures work with them makes a big difference. And I'll just quickly say I worked for 4 years in Bangladesh, and Bangladesh had developed a very robust disaster response system. To India and Pakistan's embarrassment, Bangladesh now has higher human development indicators. Not a great government, but good human development indicators. And a lot of it was because they really did work on the disaster response. Bangladesh still has massive disasters, but the political, economic, social structure is there to deal with it.
Ruth or Gina, are there any lessons learned that might apply from your work to what's happening here in the Americas or somewhere else?
I guess the one thing that really strikes me is from the earlier sessions today and all three of our presentations is early today people were talking about sort of cascading risks. And I think what we can see here, having just been in the west coast of the States for a few months, you know, if you look at the fires and the heat and the drought, I mean, those are just sort of three climate-related issues. You then bring in politics and COVID and employment, and we really have to move into this era of seeing things holistically. We can't keep them separate, and it's hard. And I know in universities you tend to have, you know, we're branching out into more interdisciplinary work, which is great. But seeing good interdisciplinary work that works with the scientists and the social scientists and the economists and the people on the ground, it's hard work, and you don't see a lot of it. So I think we really need to move into that space of applied scholarship, and somebody said earlier, working with the sort of policymakers and the practitioners on the ground. What are the questions they're grappling with, rather than trying to just think of our academic questions? So it's really lovely to see these other presentations and see how that's coming together.
But, you know, there's one area that I think brings us into focus on a very narrow scale in California, and that is that I can be talking about, my goodness, we've got to conserve water, we've got to build drought reserves, but the land use planners in the city of Salinas, they're talking about, yikes, what we really need is more housing. And so actually, we just recently received a second grant from the Strategic Growth Council to try to link those two, because you never see them discussed together, or I should say not never, but very rarely do you see them discussed together. And we realized that when we brought water folks and then land use planners into the same room for another project, and it was like, oh, they really have different goals, and they're not necessarily seeing that bigger picture. And so the question is, you probably can do both, but how do you make it work so that it is a win-win situation? So it goes along on a much narrower scale with what Gina is saying.
Absolutely, and that's the huge challenge, right? We have the need to work between scientists, and then also like in the applied field, the need to work amongst different types of planners, different agencies and community organizations. Sometimes I think it's really easy to not think about the structural issues, the inequality, and only focus on the environmental piece, right? And so I think that's a really good challenge that we're going to have to grapple with as we deal with climate change. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, just to add the sort of environmental justice, social justice piece is we've got to do that more. And the reality is those processes take time. And so it's this real tension that we have. We've got to urgently change how we do things, but we've got to build relationships, we've got to build trust, we've got to listen to diverse voices, and the elite and the way of doing things that have served a small few can no longer continue, and that's uncomfortable. And so there are going to be difficult conversations around water, around all sorts of things, around access to resources, but we have to have those difficult conversations.
Absolutely. So I don't see any other questions in the question box. Again, to those that are attending, if you have any final questions, now is the time to ask. Do we have any final remarks that our panelists would like to make? No, I think we're good. So this brings us to the end of our session. We're about 10 minutes early, so I give you 10 minutes back of your life today. Thank you again to our panelists, to our audience for joining us today. You know, as I mentioned at the start of our session, we still have to learn a lot about climate change and what it means for our groundwater supply, our drinking water supplies, and governance, and what it means for frontline communities. And it was just really amazing to hear your presentations today and how you've highlighted the need for a collaborative approach to addressing these challenges. So I hope that you've all learned something today about ways we can better understand the linkages and challenges and solutions to a drought resilient future. We do want to invite you to our next session, which starts at 3:30. We will be talking about the effects of temperatures on behavior, adaptation at home, minimizing water quality impacts, integrating climate and transportation planning. And again, thank you for tuning in.